Hi guys, I'm Tom Farrow. We're here at 6 Bullets in London and I'm going to be teaching you how to do a horror sci-fi handpiece. Okay, let's go. Okay guys, so we're just going to be working on the stencil here. I've already pre-shaved my client's hand, making sure that we're not getting any scratches or any abrasive kind of cuts or anything to the area. I actually use Stencil Premium for all of my stencils. When I'm doing a lot of large scale work, I used to do everything by hand rather than using a Thermofax. So with these thermal stencils, I kind of feel like they don't stay as long as if you were to do it by hand. So I always put 3 layers of my stencil solution on beforehand, just to make sure that everything is going to stay throughout the whole session. So once we've kind of applied the actual solution to the hand, we're just going to make sure it's got a nice tacky, sticky feel on there. So what I try and do is get my client to stand in a totally natural position. So just stand up as you normally would do. We're going to position it to make sure that the composition works with his other pieces as well that he's got on his arm here. So I always make sure that I'm pressing the stencil to make sure that every piece of that stencil is applied properly to the skin. It's not too much of an issue for me if it kind of blurs out slightly within the areas. I'd rather have it there and be able to rub it off later within the session than to not get the whole stencil on. And once I've kind of got the basic of the stencil on, I always take a little step back and just make sure that from a distance, everything is kind of looking good. Always be very careful as well when you're peeling that stencil off. Do it nice and slowly so you can see if any areas haven't quite printed properly, and you can always repress that down to make sure that the stencil is properly on the skin. And there's a few little areas around here as well that I'm going to continue, just to make sure that it joins all the way to the edge of the hand on here. So when he joins it into his inner forearm as well, everything will connect perfectly in there. But for now, that works really, really well. This is my station here. To give you a start, we've got 2 inkjector machines, one being the Nano, one being the Pen. We've also got my Killer Ink Stella 2.0 needles here, my whole configuration, which we'll go into more detail into later. We've got a full Fusion grey wash set here as well, so from black all the way down to white. And again, we're going to go into much more detail for that later too. Also, we have a Hustle Butter, some stencil stuff, and Hustle Butter foam. Okay, so we're just about to start the tattoo, so we're going to get into it. I've just picked up a 5 liner here to just mark out all of these background sections that we've got going across the knuckles. So we're just going to start off with a few little lines across this area. I'm always being very careful with the needle to make sure that we're not going too deep. These are only rough lines as well, just so we can make sure we can get the nice saturation once we get a magnum out. When you're working on the fingers, depending on how far that stencil comes down across the knuckles, you want to make sure that you've got enough stretch on the skin to make sure that the needle is hitting your desired depth. A good little tip that I like to do on the side here is if you kind of pick the finger up rather than just holding onto the whole hand, and kind of bend it slightly, and that gives you the stretch that you need. So I actually use 2 machines. For my line work, I use an inkjector pen. The stroke of that machine is a 4.25, so it's quite hard hitting. I run that machine on 8.4 volts, so it's actually quite slow. I like to make sure that we can just tighten up a few of the lines and get a few nice sharp points on it, so it allows me that movement when running on that voltage as well. For any other areas that I'm using, if I'm going to be using round shaders or if I'm going to be using magnums, then I use a Flight Nano, and that is a 3.25 stroke, and I've run that on 9.4 volts. Always making sure to soften up the skin as well before we're doing a line. I tend to only use 5 liners to get all my marking out points done, just so that I can kind of sharpen up any other edges that I need to later in the tattoo. The reason I kind of stretch the finger out like that, I kind of push the back of the finger with my thumb and then use, the back of the finger with my finger and then stretch it down with the thumb as well. That just gives it the desired stretch. Across a knuckle, it is super hard to stretch it out to where it needs to be. But this method tends to kind of get it to exactly where you want it to. And don't be afraid as well to actually move the client around to make sure that you're getting that desired stretch as well. I'm going to move over to this finger here. Again, some more Hustle Butter. the first thing that a client ever says to me about hustle butter is it smells amazing. For a client, obviously they're looking at it from a different perspective as to what we are. For me, it softens up the skin the most, and it's because I can use it on a client throughout the session, as well as actually giving it to them for their aftercare. I can see if it's actually going to cause any issues with their skin as well before they're actually applying it to their tattoo. So say for example, there was an ingredient in there or something that their skin didn't agree with, you're going to know that like pretty straight on to the session, rather than obviously working it out throughout the heel. For me, over other brands, I find a lot of the other brands are quite thin compared to Hustle Butter as well, and this doesn't tend to rub my stencil off throughout the session. So that's a very important one for me, is to making sure that the stencils are staying on for as long as they need to. So yeah, Hustle Butter's texture doesn't tend to kind of wipe it away too early, which is great. So I always like to get a lot of the lines in just to kind of give me an edge up to when I'm doing it. When I'm doing a face on the hand, it's really important to make sure that the curvature of that face doesn't kind of bend or distort with any areas, so across the knuckles and whatnot. So I try to get all of the line work in firstly, around the edge of that face, and then line the edge of that face so you're not compromising any of the composition. And then at that point I can start putting all of my dark tones and creating the contrast. I'm very, very particular when it comes to doing a stencil. Like, I like to make sure that it's absolutely spot on. And obviously when you're receiving a picture from a client that could potentially be an outside of an arm or an outside of a leg, you're looking at a flat image. So once that stencil is applied on the skin, you're gonna have to bend it just to kind of fit to the natural contours of that person. So I always like to do that in person as well. So if there's anything I need to change, then the best kind of tips that I ever received would be to actually look at the anatomy of what's underneath the skin rather than the actual skin itself. So if you're working on an arm, obviously work out the position of that client's tricep, their shoulder, how it's kind of joining into the bicep muscle, and that immediately gives you your natural flow lines to be able to work with when you're actually applying that stencil. So when the client comes in, obviously make sure that everything is 99% going to line up, but if there are any other areas as well, then you just kind of refer back to what you know is underneath the skin, and then that can kind of give you any extra tips or any extra help to be able to make sure that it looks natural within the area. I think anatomy is super important for when you're actually designing a piece. So again, that same technique that you can use on the fingers to kind of put your finger behind and then pull down with your thumb can work on the top of the hand as well, rather than having to lean on your stencil. And obviously get rid of any important details. And then for now, like I was saying earlier, this curvature line that we've got here coming round from the side of the cheek to the bottom of the chin is the most important to make sure that face sits correctly across the knuckles. So once I've done this area, like, and just lined out roughly these areas where we're going to fill in, then I'll come in and do that line, and then from there we can start putting the darks underneath. I use Fusion ink for literally everything, whether it would be my blacks, my whites. I use their grey wash set. That is a standhold in my setup, and has been for probably, I'd say, around 8 years. The reason I like it is, for one, it heals nice and dark, and two, it has a cool tone to it. So I think it's really important within black and grey to make sure that it, depending on what blacks and what grey wash set you're using, that they actually match up. So because I use their blacks, they have a cool tone to them as well. So when it's actually all healed, it looks really nice and cohesive across the whole piece. I love Fusion. For me, it's an ink that not many people tend to use for their grey wash, but the second I've had people kind of come up and see my work at conventions and they've seen the work healed, they immediately ask what ink it is, because it's quite grey once it heals as well. So my work often gets mistaken for being opaque rather than it being grey wash, and that's purely that if you saturate the grey wash enough and get the technique right, then it comes out just as grey as if you were to do it with an actual colour tone yourself. So yeah, for me they're something that I would never really change. It's an ink that fits well with my style, and the way I've kind of worked out how to use them over the years is really important as well. So how I actually use the inks themselves is, you'll be able to see at the beginning of the tutorial that there's an extra dark, a dark, medium, light and extra light. So for me that was a bit too much of a gradient to be able to work with. So how I actually mix my inks is I use Fusion Basic Black for all of my black, and then the next cap will be half black, half extra dark, then it's dark, then light, then extra light. So I take the medium out and I use the dark as my medium tone, and then I have an extra dark and black to be able to shade off of my black with. So there's much more of a higher contrast, and it's easy for you to be able to pick the areas in between a piece as well. So you can mark it out beforehand and be like, okay, this area is going to be extra dark, this needs to come off the black, so that's the one that's going to be mixed with the extra dark and black. So I just created my own system basically within their set that they created. So we're just coming back in here just to finish that under chin line, and join that into the little finger, and then we can start shading. If there's any other little bits that you need to tighten up before you come in with a magnum, just make sure you do that. Okay, cool, so we've got all of the lines put in there, so I'm just going to switch over to a small round shader, just to get all of the edges and these bottom sections of the fingers here, and then once we open up to these wider areas, then I can come in with a magnum. So I like to use an 11 round shader. Anything smaller than that I think can obviously be quite damaging to the skin depending on what areas you're using. So across a knuckle and across a finger, I like to use an 11 just to kind of meet up to the lines that we've done previously, and just get out to those wider areas so we can start filling with a magnum. And with this round shader, I have the throw quite far out on the machine. It is a 4.25 stroke, so you do have to be very careful with it. But I say when the volts are running low, as long as your hand speed matches those volts, then you won't kind of cause any damage to the area. And it's just small circles, always checking to make sure that you've got the saturation as it needs to be. If there are any other little sections that you can see that are slightly patchy, then just go back in and slightly brush back and forth with that same needle, just to saturate it as best as you can. So again, it's over a knuckle area, so you want to go back to that technique with your finger behind and pull down with your thumb just to stretch to where you need to be. And exactly the same technique with the round shader, so in slightly small circles, and then give it a good old clean. If there's any patches, then go back and forth to get your saturation. Hands are like, they're notoriously hard to tattoo for this reason alone, I believe, is that there are lots of different types of skin within one area. So if you're going to keep that handpiece kind of a knuckles and above, then your majority are going to be you're going to be dealing with the majority of it being soft skin. If you're going straight over knuckles and obviously down onto the fingers, the skin there is a lot thicker. So you're going to find that it's a lot harder to be able to saturate that area. So what you want to do is make sure that you've got a machine that is hard hitting enough that you can run on low volts, that you're not going to cause any damage to, obviously when you meet those areas that do have the harder texture, you're not going to kind of overwork the area at all. Normally I'll find that this area across here on the hand is nice and easy to work with. Anywhere from basically the knuckles down, again, it's going to get drastically harder. And the pads of the hands on this side here and just in between the knuckles, they're an area that you have to be very, very, very careful of. It's very easy to overwork those areas because it is so hard to saturate it. Then your tendency would be to try and press a bit harder and obviously to get the ink in, but going a little bit slower with a harder hitting machine, I can promise, will give you the desired effect. I think with hands as well, it's just super important to to be patient, like throughout it. There's going to be areas that once it's kind of settled within the skin, across those thicker areas where the skin is, you're going to need to go back in slightly towards the end of the session anyway, so it's always better to be nice and slow with it as you're going, rather than attacking it and thinking that going harder is going to be better and then overworking the area. So again, when you're doing these sections in between the fingers here, I always ask the client to basically spread them fingers, and you can kind of push them aside with your own fingers as well, just to make sure that you've got that desired stretch. So again, we're still using the same round shader, which is an 11.35, just getting it up to the point as to where we can start using a larger grouping to join it together. As you can see there, we've done all the points up to where they need to be, so now we can actually come in with a magnum and fill this larger area that we've got here, and then any other sections that need to be just slightly touched up just to make sure the saturation is on point, then you can go back in after and do that. But it's always best to take your time, keep cleaning it as well, so you can make sure that you're seeing it as true as it can be. So now I'm just going to get out a 23 Magnum. That is a 0.35 needle as well. I always try to use quite large groupings when I'm doing a hand, and then come back in with those smaller needles after. It's exactly the same technique that you're going to be doing with the round shader. So it's just small circles overlapping. Again, making sure you take your time with it. So what I try to do when I'm filling an area in black is just go as close to the line as you can, and then come back in with a round shader after, and just make sure that you're butting up to the edge of that line with a smaller needle. Saturation is, for me, is one of the most important things you can do in a tattoo. And the biggest tip I ever received for saturation and how I work on every single piece is patience. So it is, when you're filling in an area, not getting too excited and kind of speeding up your hand speed, and just very repetitively doing exactly the same motion over and over and over to make sure that you're reaching that desired saturation that you want it to be. Another good tip for me when I'm doing a piece is, if you want to kind of see how saturated an area is, then spray that area with your water bottle, or whether it be foam and whatnot, and take a good look under the light with it, and you'll see any areas that aren't 100% saturated. If you're working on an area that is going to need quite a lot of work in there to make sure that it's getting to the saturation that you want, then again, that comes down to your hand speed and obviously the stroke of the machine and how hard hitting that is. So as long as everything marries up with that, so if you have the right stroke and your hand speed matches that stroke of the machine, then you won't ever have any issues with saturating. I get a lot of people ask me sort of how I pack black on large scale areas, and it's not using small needles at all. It's the largest grouping you can use within that area. And like I say, then going back with those smaller needles after, just to make sure that everything is on point. You'll also be able to hear when you're working on a hand as well what areas are tougher skin. As you can hear here, where I'm working on the pad, there's a slightly more louder vibration. So we want to make sure that we're getting enough saturation within that area too. We're going to lift that finger up there and just twist this. And you want to slowly just blend that into the areas that we did with that 11 round shader earlier. You're going to find within these areas, when you're tattooing over knuckles, they're going to swell up quite fast as well, so we want to make sure that we're getting it to where it needs to be before that swelling hits. So once you've done that main area with your larger magnum, then you can come back to your round shader and just tighten up those lines on the edges. And there we go, that's a nicely saturated area across the fingers and the knuckles. Again, just triple check under the light. There's a little bit there. Again, once you've done that, you're just going to apply a little bit of hustle butter to the area. And then we're just going to let that bit settle and move across the fingers to the next one. Same thing again, 11 round shader to start off. And the same technique, to your finger behind their finger and then pull down with your thumb. And the same again in between these fingers, you want to kind of get the client to spread their fingers slightly. That's it, and then just kind of push them aside with your fingers too. Just going to switch back over to an 11 round shader just so we can tighten up those lines on the edge of where you've done the saturated black with a magnum. And again, it's just lightly brushing in, just so you're meeting up for that shading. Just switching back over to a 5 liner, just to come in and sharpen up all the points on the end of where you've just used that round shader to meet the magnum shading. Now you've got all that black done underneath and over the knuckles there, we can come back in and just see if there's any areas that need to be re-hit, just to make sure the saturation's on point. And again, it's always small needles I go back in with, so you can get those small little areas in between all of the creases in the skin, and especially over the knuckles. Switch back over to the magnum, just to do that wider space. And again, that's a 23 magnum in a 0.35 gauge. So still run, for this machine, it will be 8.4, which is a 4.25 stroke, and for the other machine, 3.25 stroke, and then I up the bolts to 9.4. So it's back to the 11 round shader here, just to start the shading underneath the chin. Again, it's over a knuckle, so we want to make sure that we're getting that saturation properly. So again, pull the client's hand up, kind of put your finger underneath and kind of pull down with the thumb. Just switch back over to a 5 liner, just tighten up the edges. So now that we've done all of the area around the knuckles and going down onto the fingers, we're going to start carving out the shape of the face and all of the surrealistic elements that I've added to it as well. So again, 5 liner, we're just going to mark out a few of these straight lines that are going through here. These are just ghost lines, just to make sure that we're keeping the right composition throughout the whole thing. But as soon as that stencil comes off, then I like to get some lines in, just so we've got a good guide to run off. And we're going to swap that 23 mag for a 15 mag. Again, these are all 0.35 gauge, so a 12 gauge needle, 0.35 needle size. Just going to drop my throw in a little bit so we can get some nice smooth shading. And as I explained earlier, I've got an extra dark and a black mix to come off of that black, so that's what we're going to be using for this tone. And then just button up to the edge of the black shading, we're just going to do slow back and forward motions. My mag is tilted on a 45-degree angle, and I'm just using the corner of it just to meet those corners. As you can see, we're not rushing the shading, it's just slow pendulum movements to build up that shade. I'm just dipping in the same one again, so it's the extra dark and black, and we're going to move under and just create the shadow underneath the chin. And once you've done the work with the mag, just getting those bigger smooth shades in. If there's any areas that need you to kind of tuck into some small corners, then I go back to an 11 round shader, dipping in the same again, so half black, half dark tone. The idea of what we're trying to do with black and grey when we're saturating it is we're treating it the same as if we was doing a colour tattoo, but just with the grey wash. That's how you're going to get that desired effect of the actual greys coming back healed and them having a real nice smooth grey tone to them rather than being washed out with the skin. Just swapped over to a 5 liner just to make sure that we can butt right up to the edge I've got a diamond shape that's going to be sitting across the whole of her face on the actual tattoo, so we want to make sure that those lines are spot on. I'm just getting out an 11 mag as well, so we've got a little bit of shading underneath the chin, just where the neck is, so we just want to be able to make sure we can get into those corners. So I swapped out to an 11 magnum, 0.35 again. And this time we're going to go for the extra dark. Just blend into that extra dark and black that we just put in there. I'm using a downward motion with a mag, not going back up with a needle, just to make sure that we get a nice smooth shade. And then from there, what I do with the same needle, same tone, is go back in the opposite direction. So from the bottom to the top, and that gives you that full saturation of the area. When you're first putting that in the skin, it's going to look like the tones are quite similar between them, but once it's settled after a few hours, you're going to be able to see the difference between the two, and especially once it's healed as well. I'm bringing my throw a little bit, so now we're going to work in this section here. So we're just going to blend from the shadow on the chin up into what would be classed as the skin tone. And for this, I'm going to mix my dark and my medium together. So I dip into the dark, do a little bit towards that, and then dip into the next one from there. Exactly the same pendulum movement, as if you were doing the shading with the black. Again, always making sure that you've got the right stretch on the skin as well. That's super important to making sure that you're getting smooth shades. Before I change every tone as well, when I'm doing my shading, I make sure I wash the needle out properly, just so you're not mixing between the tones and getting a darker tone. So just to blend into our darker tones there, I've just dipped into my light. I'm just going to slowly blend into that dark tone there. And if I'm looking for a tone in between the two, just to kind of flatten out an area so there's not any negative space left, and I dip between the main tone that I'm using throughout the face, so that'll be my dark tone, and the light tone, so it gives me a mid in between. Okay, so now I've done the shading all around the bottom jaw. Now I can start coming in, and how I tend to do a face is I'll always do the shadow underneath the lips first, and then that whatever shadow that is, or whatever tone you put that shadow in, sorry. So for me, I'm going to put it in extra dark. It means that all of the lips are going to be one tone darker than that, so it's going to be extra dark and black, just to give it the contrast. So now I've got the basic structure of the chin and the face there. That tells me what kind of tones I'm going to have left. So in between the black here, our main tone that we're going to put through the face there, which is dark, and then our lights, we can tell what kind of tones we need to put in these negative spaces here. So for me, I always kind of break that down between an extra light and a light, depending on the client's skin tone. But for this client, we're going to be working with both. It's got quite soft skin, so it's going to be allowed to put the white in towards the end as well, so it allows us to get that extra layer on top. So for the lips, how I tend to do those is I'll always use a 3 and a 5 liner to make sure that we can make them as sharp as possible. Anything that's kind of forward on a face, so whether it be the eyes, the lips or the mouth, the main 3 features, I always try to use smaller needles for them, so it's a little bit more packed into the skin, so when it heals, compared to the soft shading next to it, you're always going to have those 3 elements. So I have a very specific way of doing lips, so I like to do the underline of the lip first to create the shape, then come in with a liner and do the inside of the teeth, just so we can make sure that they're in there as well and they're viewable once we've got the shading over the top. And then once I've done the shading on the teeth, then I come back and actually just create the actual shape of the lips with the dark first, and then head into my mid-tones and my lights from there. Okay, so I've just finished using the 3-round liner just to carve the shape of the lips out, and then I've gone back to my 11-round shader just to actually start packing the black, and that will give you the full shape of the lip. And then once you've got the black in there, you can come in with your mid-tones and your lights and kind of put all the detail in with that. So now I've done all the black on the lips, I'll just come back in with a 3-round liner and just mark out all the rest of the shapes of the lips. And then I can use the same needle to create the details of it being such a small piece on the hand. We want to make sure we can get as much detail in there as possible, so a 3 liner is really good for this. When I'm doing a hand, one of the main things that I'm trying to look for, not in a client, but just in like the skin type itself, is how old that person is. 2, as to whether they work outside a lot with their hands. It makes a huge difference if, say, you've got a client who does a job where they're consistently using their hands outdoors, like a builder or a tradesman, compared to someone who works in an office. Like you're going to find that the person who works in the office, the skin is a lot easier to be able to work with. So it definitely does make it harder depending on the skin type, but again, it's more about having the patience with it. It's exactly the same techniques, but just slowing them down to make sure that you're not kind of overworking the skin too quickly. And in regards to detail on hands, again, for me, it's a patience thing. You can put that detail in, but because it's a bit tougher skin, it's going to take a couple more hours for it to actually be visible within the skin. So instead of trying to overwork the area to make sure that it's visible straight away, it's a case of putting it in the skin, letting it settle, moving on to another area, and then sort of coming back later in the session to be able to make sure that everything's in place where it needs to be. So now we've done all the detail on the lips, I'm just going to put some hustle butter across it, just let those let the skin soften up there. I'll just swap back to my 11-round shader, and we're going to mark out the nostrils. And again, do the exact same process. We're going to go from my extra dark and dark, down to my darkest tone to create the shape of the nose, and then we build it up with the mid and the lights from there. Again, between each tone, you want to make sure you're washing out your needle correctly, just to make sure you don't get any darker spots. So once I've got the basic shape of the nose down with a round shader, I'll just swap over to my 11 mag. Again, all of these magnums are 0.35. Just bring the throw in slightly, so we can get some nice smooth shading, and then we're just going to start putting all of the tones in to shape the nose. If there's any really tight bits on the nose as well, I always swap back to my round shader and pull the throw right in. Again, so we can get nice smooth shading. We're back to the 11 Magnum now. Now we've done that left nostril, we can swap back to the Magnum just to create the smoother, larger shades. So now I've created the shape of the nose and put all of the dark and mid-tones in. I'm just going to come back in with a 3 liner and start shaping the drops of blood that are coming out of her eyes. So now I've done those blood dripping out of the eye, where we've got the diamond shape sitting in the middle of the face. I'm just going to come back in with a 3 liner and just mark out the edges of that, the corner of the diamond, just to make sure it's super sharp to the background. So for anybody that's starting to actually head towards realism, one of the best bits of advice that I ever got was to understand shadowing and contrast. So realism requires you to be able to work with the skin tone. So a lot of artists that I see nowadays are too, in my opinion, are too afraid to actually leave a lot of skin tone to let it age well. Realism that lasts the test of time has a good amount of like negative space put into it. So it requires you from switching up your drawing techniques, how you draw on paper, obviously, to transferring that over to skin. In the same way that you would leave a lot of negative area within your drawing, it works exactly the same with skin, and it tends to be that the pieces that last the longest are the ones that have the most contrast on them. So it's very, very, very important for realism to obviously understand a gradient, so from light to dark, but also where to leave that negative space within it as well. So it was a big mistake that I made when I first started tattooing, because I was predominantly self-taught. It took me a lot of years really to learn that the more skin you leave, the better your tattoo is going to age over time, rather than what it's looking like online or what it's looking like via a photograph or even a video. So I think most people who want to go down the route of realism have an understanding of what a realistic image looks like, but to transfer that into how you actually tattoo it is a very, very, very different thing. So yeah, that was probably the best bit of advice that I ever received, was to concentrate on contrast. And that was quite far into my career as well that I actually got that advice. So I think I was tattooing probably just under 7 years at that point. So there was a lot of mistakes that I kind of made myself from not having the right advice. So if I can kind of put that out to someone and stop them making the same mistakes as what I did, then I think that's good. For me, like, gaining inspiration to actually do a design normally starts with a film. If I'm gonna be doing some kind of horror sci-fi piece that involves like aliens, for example, then my first port of call would be to go and watch Alien and kind of get my mind in the right place that it needs to. Because it's something that predominantly doesn't really exist, again, that's what I was trying to explain earlier in regards to saying that there's no real right or wrongs to it. So if you want to add something really kind of out there to it, you can do. And for me, where I kind of get a lot of my images from nowadays would be AI. So I use Midjourney for a lot of my base layer designs, instead of using your standard Pinterest or Google or whatever kind of search engine you use. For me, if I want something quite specific, which horror sci-fi normally is, then I'd use that as my base layer and then continue to build off of that. So in the same way that I was saying about the contrast and how it's important to leave those areas of skin, I'd find an image, and then even with that image, whether it's from AI or if I'm lucky enough to find one online that I think will work, then that also requires me to do a lot of editing to that to turn it into the style as well. So the circles and stuff that I've always done sort of in my designs, they come from the graffiti days. I was always obsessed with circles. So they kind of just initially got added in and then ended up being kind of breakers really, to kind of break up the darker sections within my pieces, because a lot of them are quite dark. I'm just starting to create the shape of the eye with a 3-round liner. For me, on any face, the eye is the most important feature, so it's really important to make sure that you get all of the lines spot on, the eyelashes looking realistic, and making sure that you get the depth in the eye that it needs, so when it heals over time it's going to age well. So for me, a 3-round liner is a really good thing to use for that, and I don't really tend to go above a 5-round shader either, whether it's something small like this or whether it's a large scale piece as well. I still use the same needle setup. Okay, so now we've got this piece to the point of where we've got a little bit of structure in the face. I'm now going to work on this strip in between this negative section we've got there and the top of this background here. So it just carves out the shape of the eye and the side of the cheek. So I'm going to be going back in with a 15 mag, again, on all 0.35 needles. And we're going to be using that main tone that we're going to use throughout the face, which will be a dark tone. First of all, I'm just carving in a little line with a mag on a side, just because we don't want a heavy line on the inside of this diamond shape. So I'm just using the side of the magnum. It's exactly the same motion as we was doing down towards the lips as well, so it's just a pendulum motion back and forth with my magnum slightly tilted. So I've just swapped my machine over from my inkjet pen to the Flight Nano. So this one, compared to the other one, is a much softer machine. I've got the soft bar on it and the 3.25 stroke on it as well, so it allows me to work with a softer shading much easier. Again, I'm using the 15 mag. with a 0.35 needle. I always personally prefer to use the 3.5 needles over the 0.30s. I'm just able to pack the area a lot quicker with that, and especially when I'm trying to saturate the area with grey wash as well, to get that kind of desired smooth grey effect once it's healed. 0.35s will always be a lot better for you to doing that. But if you are going to use the 0.35s, then you need to make sure that you're dropping your volts down as well, just to make sure you're not overworking the skin. Once we've done this area here, we're going to work our way into this background here and then start creating the left hand side of the face and just give it the contrast throughout it. Then go into the background and then we can start working on his highlights. I think blood in black and grey is probably one of the hardest things to do on a horror portrait. It took me a long time to work out how to do it, and it's basically whatever light tone you do within the face or whatever subject matter you're going to be doing within the foreground, switch that entirely into the darkest tone that you've got and put black next to it. So if you're doing like a light and a medium in the face, then make sure that the blood that you're doing on the face would either be extra dark and black or literally just solid black with white highlights into it. Once that's kind of translated into how it's going to look when it's healed, you want the blood to be a lot more prominent on the face than the rest of it. So the only way that you're ever going to achieve that with longevity is by doing it in a real dark tone next to your light tones. So again, like I was saying earlier, it's more because there is no right or wrong to it. In regards to the texture, I get quite loose when I'm doing texture on it. So the majority of the texture I'll do on a face will be done with a round shader. And as long as you've got the direction of whatever the way that texture is going on the face, then you can obviously just add your own textures, your own elements to that texture, sorry. So shading wise, for techniques, I would honestly say dots and kind of, not squiggly lines, but kind of lines that are going in the direction of whatever the contour is on the face, always your best bet to go with. And then from there, once it's fully settled in the skin, then you can go back in with the darker tones and kind of give it a little bit more depth as well. It's more about keeping, for me anyway, it's more about keeping the same technique throughout the whole face. So if you want all of the shading to look cohesive throughout the whole piece, then you've got to be quite regimented in how you actually approach the shading. So instead of getting excited and kind of speeding up the hand speed, or kind of changing your voltage, it's more a case of making sure that you keep those techniques exactly the same throughout the whole shading in the face, and then everything will match once you kind of get towards the end of it. That's how I tend to do it, and I've not really kind of deviated from that since I found that technique. So even when I'm doing sections on this face as well, on here, it's repeating the same process. So if I'm doing black and grey shading here and I want to keep it smooth, it's exactly the same shading that I'll be doing in the background there. So technique wise, it's just repeating it into that area but changing tones to give it the contrast. So with the inkjector, with a Flight Nano, I use either a 21 or a 25mm grip. I like to keep the grips quite small, just so I can get quite a tight grip on it while I'm actually working. I personally don't like to have kind of like a really large grip. It kind of stretches my thumb out a little bit too far and can get a little bit achy after doing quite a long day. So yeah, so I use that with the Flight Nano, and obviously with the pen, they come with a standard grip anyway, so you don't have to change them. So I'm just going to switch my needles up now. I'm going to start working on this little background circle that we've got here. Once we've done that, then that is all that side complete around there until we do the highlights. Then we can move over to on the left side and start creating the shapes and curving the left hand side of the face. So now we're just going to work on the background around the left hand side of the face and create the contrast on the left eye as well. There's a small lens flare that we need to do there over the top of the face, and then it's just a small bit of background down there. Come back in, tighten up any little areas that need it, and then we can start putting the highlights in the whole piece. Just going to swap over to my free liner to do the eyelashes. So when I'm doing lashes on a face, I think they're like quite crucial to making an eye look right. So there's a very certain way of making them look like they're going in the same direction throughout the whole thing. So depending on whether you're kind of going towards the left of an eye or to the right of an eye will be dependent on obviously what way those lashes are going. I see a lot of portraits myself where they're not in the right direction, and it kind of really does throw an eye off. So make sure whatever direction you pick, depending on whether it's on the right or the left, you just go the opposite way. And that's how I've always been taught how to do the eyelashes. Just going to switch back over to my 11 Magnum 0.35, and that just gives us the last little chance to do with a little bit of shading on the left hand side of the cheek. If I'm using any configuration of round shaders, then it is literally just small circles to pack the area. So I'm not letting the needle go full depth in, I'm just brushing the surface. And as you can see when I wipe it there's already a base layer to work off. So then I just keep going with that and then keep building that layer up until the point of darkness of what I want it to be. Obviously without overworking the skin, sorry. So yeah, it's more a case about being a little bit softer with the round shaders. You can do everything with them though, so it's the reason I use them a lot within my pieces, is you can go from shading to nice smooth shading with a little bit more depth and pressing a little bit harder, and changing the actual technique to a pendulum back and forth motion. You can also pack black with the same needle, but obviously will take a lot longer within a larger area. So first things first, when I'm doing the white, is one of the main things that I'd recommend every tattoo artist to do would be to get fresh needles out to make sure that those needles aren't muddied. There's no extra kind of ink drops in there that are going to surprise you halfway through and turn your white to go slightly grey. So make sure you've got a whole new setup and configuration ready to go. I use Fusion White. It's quite a watery ink, but I prefer to use that over some of the thicker inks just because it's easier to put into the skin and doesn't kind of spread across the tattoo, and it saves you having to wipe all across your client's fresh tattoo too. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a 5 liner. We're going to work around this diamond shape that we've got on the face there and get the main elements in of that. That will lift the face forward away from the background, and then once we've done that we can start going into more of the features. So I only ever really put it in the background, in the lips and in the eyes, and just on the edge of the face. So we're going to get going with this. And for the white on the voltage as well, I just up it to 8.8 rather than 8.4. The way that I get my white to pop on a dark horror piece is by making sure that you're picking the right areas in the design. So I only really want to kind of accentuate certain areas. I want to make sure I'm not packing too much white into the larger scale areas across the piece as well. So for me, it's just about lifting the foreground away from the background and bringing anything that is forward on a face, so i.e. the lips, the nose, the eyes, just putting enough dots and detail in there that it kind of lifts away from the rest of the face. So it's not going to take away from the dark background. All it's going to do is just basically accentuate the shape of the face and just be able to make you see the edge of that a little bit more compared to how dark the actual background is. So depending on the size of the area that I'm working with, when I'm using a liner, a lot of the time, if it's the width of the line I'm going to use, then I'll just pull a normal line with it. If it's slightly wider, then I kind of do little dots and little circles just to fill it in, let it settle into the skin first so you can see how it's going to take depending on how much that client is bleeding. And then if need be, once it's all settled in, I go back in and put a second layer over the top of that. So once the white has actually bled out, I'll kind of give it a quick spray with some Bactine, let all that settle in for 5 minutes, and then go back to it in any areas that need to, just to kind of make sure that that white is as saturated as humanly possible. If I had a client who had some skin issues when it was coming to the white, and if it was bleeding too much, then normally what I would tend to do is take away the elements of putting it kind of in on the edge of the face and in the background, and just only simplify the white highlights and just put dots basically within the lips and in the eyes, just to bring those forward slightly. And if need be, we can always come back on another session and just put another layer of white in when the skin's not as aggravated, just to make sure that it's actually taking well on the skin. My do's and don'ts for white is, first of all, as I said, make sure you've got fresh needles. Try not to dip in the water cup that you've been using throughout the whole session for your other needles. So I always keep 2 cups, as you can see on my station. One will be for the black and grey needles, and the other one will be a completely fresh cup, so I can dip within that to actually wash out my needle for the white in case you need to. Apart from that, it's just making sure that you have enough patience to allow the white to bleed out before you actually start going back into it, because it's very easy to make it look like white is in the skin straight away, and then once you look back at it, once it's healed and whatnot, you can see some certain areas where it would need another hit. So again, as you can see now we filled in these areas on here, the blood has started to come out on the client, so we want to make sure that you just leave that to do its thing before we actually go back into it and give it a clean. So that would be how I would do it. So if I was to switch consistency on the white, it would be totally dependent on the actual tattoo that I'm doing. For something like this on a hand, it can get a little bit sore after a while within the area. So dependent on the client's skin, if you've got someone who's going to be got quite weathered skin, then you're going to find it's going to swell drastically straight away. So putting the white back into that with a thick consistency, you'll find that it's going to sit in between the actual pores of the skin and the creases in the skin, which you'll find very hard to wipe away. Again, it's causing more abrasion to the skin, and obviously you don't want to cause your client too much pain. So for me, using a thinner white just allows you to actually wipe that away a lot easier, and to stop basically any extra pain for your client as well throughout the session. So the way I actually put the white into the skin is basically a back and forth motion with a liner needle, just to get the base layer down, and then, as I said, letting it bleed. And then from there, if I need to, I'll come back in with small circular motions, just to basically fill the area in, rather than just doing a line. Sometimes the lines can get a little bit bitty with the white, depending on what white you're using. Again, another reason as to why I use a thinner one, because it allows a better ink flow. For me personally, I have used thicker whites in the past as well, and it just tends to not flow as well through the needle. And as I said previously, you're going to get those areas where it's going to stick quite a lot to the skin, and then it's going to be super hard to wipe off. So yeah, motion wise, small circles and a back and forward on the line, just to get it as deep as possible without overworking. And then any other areas that need it, once you've let it settle, you can come back in with those small circles and just fill those in. So now that we've got a base layer down there, we can see which areas are going to bleed the most. So what I tend to do is just assess what areas are going to need another little hit. So like down here across the knuckle, we definitely know there's going to be a little bit more that's going to be needed there. So we just do the smaller circular motions over the line that we've done, just to fill it in. So now that we've done the main line going around the edge of the face in the diamond shape, I'm just going to come back into the features, and this is a really simple one. So it's just small circular motions, just to fill in any areas, just to bring all of those bits forward that are on the face. So i.e. in the teardrops, it's going to be in the pupils, in the eyes, in the lips. So these are just little dots just to accentuate, rather than actually filling in the larger areas with white. So same as previous, just let that area bleed out before you go in and wipe it, and just allow it to settle in. We're going to move down to the lips. I think what's really important when you're doing whites is to make sure that you're picking the areas dependent on your client's skin tone. So if you're finding that you've got a client that's got really pale skin, then their skin is always going to hold white better, than someone who has got weathered skin, works outside, a bit of a tan. You're going to find for people that do have a tan, that white is going to come back with a slightly cream colour to it. This is nothing to do with the actual ink itself, it's more to do with how the actual skin is over the top of that tattoo. So again, when a client comes in, assess their skin tone, and that will help you basically work out what areas are going to be able to take the white, and if they're not able to take the white, then it's basically just something where you can pick certain areas that accentuate the features. So if my client had a really heavy tan on his hand here, then I would only be doing the white in the lips and in the eye, and the rest of it I would just leave as skin. That allows it to obviously age better over time, and with longevity being the most important thing of a tattoo, as I said, I think it's really important to assess that before you actually start doing the design itself. So whether that's in the consultation process, or whether that's if you're not able to meet your client beforehand, whether it's on the day, if there are certain changes that need to be made within that tattoo, then do that mentally as you're working throughout it, just to make sure that the client can get the best possible tattoo at the end. So the main needles that I use for all of my white, like I said to you previously, I've got a basic setup that I use for it. It'll be a 5 liner, an 11 magnum and an 18 round shader. All of these needles are Stella 2.0. I absolutely love these liners for white. The 18 round shaders are some of my favourite needles to use just in any piece, let alone on the white. And the way the magnums are quite controlled and they're not bouncing around within the actual cartridge itself allows me to butt up right to the edge of when I'm doing white highlights, sorry. So yeah, the Stella 2.0s are something that have now become a permanent fixture within my configuration, just because of the quality of them, really. So for me, if I've got a client who's got some skin issues when it comes to the white, like if it's bleeding too much, then the time of when I know where to stop within that area would be that if the blood that is coming out is repelling the ink. So if the blood is coming out quicker than what you're actually putting the white in, then it's time to stop. It's literally that simple. There's no issues with inviting a client back for a second session, just to make sure that the skin can obviously take the ink as best as possible. Otherwise, what's going to happen is you're going to end up overworking that area just to make sure that you're actually getting the ink in, which is inevitably obviously going to cause more issues with your heel later down the line. So as you're working throughout it, make sure that the client isn't bleeding too much. What you can do in between that, just to assess it, is to put some Bactine on, wrap it in some cling film, get the client to stand up so all the blood rushes to the area, and then you can see exactly how much blood is going to be coming out of that whilst you're tattooing that area too. At that point, obviously, if it is going to be too much, then stop the session, put the white in the areas where it's not, and then invite that client back for another session to give them the best possible result. I'm just going to swap over to an 11 Magnum now, just to shade into the background. We don't want any really precise, harsh lines in these areas, so a Magnum is really good just to kind of shade up into that. And it's going to be doing the exact same motion, so just a pendulum motion, as you can see on this area here. So if you do get any areas like this top bit where the white has actually stuck to the skin, then I wouldn't recommend just using your normal spray bottle. Something like Hustle Butter's antimicrobial foam works really well to take that top layer of the white off without causing any too much trauma to the skin. As you can see, it comes off very, very easily. As long as you've got enough Vaseline, or whether you're using Hustle Butter, whatever product you're using, just make sure you apply enough of that before you're actually putting the white in, so when you're wiping it, it comes off nice and easy. I'm just going to swap back to my 5 liner just to do these dots in the background. Again, it's just small circular motions. You want to try and get in and out as quick as possible without causing any trauma to the skin, and then, as I said previous, you can always come back once it's all bled out and put the other little bits in once you need to. Okay, and that is the tattoo done. So I'm just going to wipe it down with some antimicrobial foam. And then this is going to help take the redness out and get all the excess white that's sitting on top of the skin. Once I've done that, I'm going to spray it with some Bactine, wrap it up, and let it settle for 10-15 minutes before we go through all the aftercare. Okay, so we're going to go into the aftercare here. First thing I'm going to do is just apply a small layer of hustle butter across the actual piece itself. I use tattoo armor pads for all of my aftercare, so it's good to put a first layer of cream on just to allow that pad to actually stick and work its magic overnight. So once I've done that, with a hand, I have a very specific way of wrapping it with these pads, just to make sure that it's going to hold. With my client actually being a tattoo artist himself, obviously he's going to be going back to work tomorrow and putting gloves over, which isn't an issue as long as it's padded up in the correct way. So once we've got this, the first thing I'm going to do is take the pad itself, and we're going to put your fingers out there for a spin. That's it, and just keep it like that. Put your thumb in slightly. Just drop that there. Keep them fingers for me like that. That's it. So I'm going to apply the pad, and then lift your arm up for me, and wrap that directly under. It's a little bit uncomfortable for the client to start. Drop your arm down for me. And once we've got that, I just need to grab that a second. We're going to use some micropore just to apply a seal across the top, just to make sure that no air is getting to it. So the whole idea of these tattoo armor pads is that they need to be nice and tight to the skin to actually work their magic throughout the night. So once you've got that first layer of the tape on, it's not a problem to go absolutely mental with the tape to make sure that it is actually tight to the skin. It's crucial that it is actually working that way. If you're going to leave any kind of pockets for any air to get into, then the pads aren't going to work how they need to. So I like to put as much tape on there as possible to make sure that we are getting the desired effect. If I'm wrapping a hand, then I get my client to put their hand in a mitten and wrap it all the way around. And then from there, what we do is we make sure that we cut in between the fingers. So a couple of little finger slits on here. And one on your thumb. Once we've done that, you can fold the thumb back and fold this section back, which allows your client to have a little bit of movement in the hand as well. So Ben, if you don't mind, just turn your hand over for me and just lay that down there. And then this is pretty self-explanatory from here, guys. So we're just going to stick this section to the palm of his hand. And again, go nuts with the tape just to make sure that it's nice and tight. Turn that over for me. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky. So after a couple of years of using these pads, this is the best method I've found to actually wrap a hand. You can also, if you've got any elements from the piece that are coming down onto the fingers, you can also protect them too. So we put the first bit of tape on the first finger flap that we put there, and we tuck it underneath. And again, you're going to be sticking it to this area under here. Spread those fingers for me. I use this method for every time I'm doing a handpiece, and every time I've used it, it's always come back nice throughout the hills. It is a little bit of a difficult thing to be able to wrap yourself. So you do want to make sure that if you've got someone at home or someone who can do this for you, then the best tip that I can give you is that on the night of doing your tattoo on that client, make sure that that client actually takes a picture of the wrap that you've done so that they can repeat that process exactly the same, or even video it would be even better. And then once you've got the 4 fingers wrapped in, then you just put another section around there just to tighten it. And there we go. We've got a full wrapped hand with tattoo armor. Okay guys, so that's the piece finished there. I hope you like it. If you wanted to drop us a comment with any questions you have, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. But for now, I'm gonna go home, put my feet up and watch The Greatest Showman auditions.